Is it possible to be a James Bond fan and not have certain hopes and expectations for the future? I'm not sure, but it's part of the fun of being a fan. As long as you don't put too much stock into these things and are able to take new entries on their own terms, I see nothing wrong with speculating about where the series might go or what you would do if in charge of the franchise. Every film is like an event. They don't come out very frequently these days, and so unlike many other franchises, a release date feels worthy of being marked on my calendar. Now that Daniel Craig's time is well and truly over, many fans have spent the last 4 years wondering about the next move for the series. There are some who were pretty dissatisfied with Craig's run and tone, so the wait might be excruciatingly long for them since they've yearned for something that feels closer in spirit to the earlier films for almost 20 years. Others, like myself, generally were pretty happy with the Craig experiment, even if we didn't like every film, and are intrigued to see how the run will influence later films. Many great actors have had their time in the tux, and it's always interesting to see if a new Bond will either continue the same path as the previous actor or go in a different direction. That second route is more often what happens, and I'm grateful for that, as it demonstrates the versatility of the franchise. It means there was no need to call in the mortician once Connery left. Every subsequent actor brought something unique to the part and has at least one film that resonates with the public. Who knows where we might go when Bond number 7 emerges onto the silver screen and guides us into the future. Of course, there is still no solid movement on that new film at the time of this recording, just rumblings. In 2024, Amazon MGM Studios announced they hired a former head of Netflix, Scott Stuber, in an attempt to revive the United Artists label, which had a hand in producing every official Bond film from Dr. No through to Skyfall, with their logo even showing up at the front of most of the films until The World Is Not Enough. However, there was an even bigger shakeup later when a report from the Wall Street Journal detailed an impasse between Amazon heads and the folks at Eon regarding the future of the series. According to the article, Amazon is viewing the series as content, a rather detached and cold term that suggests that Bond is no more important to them than any of their other material that regularly gets launched on Amazon Prime Video. Another executive admitted that she didn't, quote, think James Bond was a hero, with the room going silent. Barbara Broccoli took offense at these attitudes and told friends that the heads of Amazon are, quote, idiots. As a fan who's loved the series for more than 20 years, I'm relieved to know the hiatus is less because of a lack of interest on Eon's part, and more because they are very protective of the character. I'm happy to wait for someone to come along that understands and respects the character enough to be passionate about him and his adventures. While I don't doubt Amazon's more calculated approach would bring 007 back into the public eye in a way he hasn't been for some time, I'd be depressed if we saw films that felt more like the Sony Spider-Man villain movies like Morbius and Madam Web, something made more because it was good business and less because the filmmakers were driven at their cores by ideas that ignited their spirits, be it remarkable action sequences, a story to tell, or a new take on the character. Whatever you think of Daniel Craig's run, it's hard to argue that something like Casino Royale or Skyfall weren't passion projects for their creators. I might not agree with every choice they made, but I can respect that some spark of joy and imagination were behind the films. I'd rather have 2 to 3 films a decade made from a place of love and excitement than obligatory entries every 2 years. With that out of the way, let's get into what I'd like to see if I had a say on the future of Bond. This is by no means my manifesto, where I state my demands that a film must meet or else it's dead to me. I will give every film a chance, as I've seen other projects in the past that are the polar opposite of what I wanted that won me over. I'll be breaking these elements down into categories and using past Bond films and other projects to illustrate my point so you hopefully get an idea of what I'd like to see. Feel free to skip around to the categories you are interested in. First up, let's talk about a more recent idea that has been suggested by some fans. The idea is to have the films go back to the 1950s or 60s and do either more faithful adaptations of the original Ian Fleming novels or new plots set in that time. There are some merits to this approach. Obviously, we've seen great Bond stories from this time period, so we know it can work. The films that were more faithful to the Fleming books, like From Russia with Love, Goldfinger, and On Her Majesty's Secret Service, tend to be beloved ones, with many appreciating the later more Fleming-esque adventures of the Living Daylights in Casino Royale. And obviously, with Cubby and Harry starting to deviate more wildly from the books, starting, I'd say, with You Only Live Twice, that means there are some great stories and characters that were adapted more in name only, rather than being more straightforward translations. Since we've made it crystal clear with Daniel Craig that multiple Bonds with different histories with some similarities are acceptable to general audiences, why not give a chance for Fleming's Moonraker or You Only Live Twice to shine with a new Bond actor? While I am a fan of the Fleming works, I must say I'm not entirely in favor of this idea for a few reasons. First up, there's not a whole lot of Fleming works left to be adapted into film form. I cited Moonraker and Twice because those are the big ones that I think could work in some form on the big screen and be exciting enough for general audiences. However, not all of the stories have that bright future. I have a hard time seeing The Spy Who Loved Me work as a Bond film, or Live and Let Die being taken seriously with a plot around Pirate's Gold. My wife even laughed about that one. I could be wrong, of course, but I think these are examples of stories that would need some polishing and serious reworking to be viable today. To be fair, I think most people calling for more faithful Fleming adaptations will make the concession that some changes would need to be made to improve the stories, and I think there's a way to do that and still be called more faithful than the early Bond films. But at that point, you'd either be in danger of losing the novelty of doing more faithful Fleming works by needing to make those changes, or you would essentially be treading the same ground as Cubby and Harry did during those early years, picking the best things and leaving the rest out. Not to mention that with some of the books, you'd end up just doing something closer to a full remake of the film. On Her Majesty's Secret Service in particular would be quite a challenge in trying to distinguish the new adaptation from the old one, as would movies like Dr. No and From Russia with Love. So with the general audience, you'd have a hard time because you'd have to justify their existence enough as separate remakes. Though I suppose Kevin McClory's Spectre would have a few words to say if he knew a third version of Thunderball was being done after he died. But the main reason I'm not in favor of this approach is because of an unintentional implication. By going back to the 50s and 60s, isn't that in some way an admission that Bond works best in his original time? That the other takes were all fine and good, but that we've run out of new ideas and that the way forward is to go backwards? That's a depressing thought to me, having enjoyed the later actors' more contemporary takes. And I think part of what makes this series so everlasting is the attempts to keep up with the current state of the world. Despite what that Amazon executive expressed, Bond is, at his core, a hero. And heroes will always be relevant, even if they are sometimes a little darker and were created for a different time. Take Sherlock Holmes, for example. I love the older, late 1800s depictions of the character, but the first thing I ever saw of him was an animated show called Sherlock Holmes in the 22nd century. And of all of the versions in the last 30 years, the one I've enjoyed the most was the BBC series with Benedict Cumberbatch. Neither of these two versions had to lose the essence of the character in order to tell stories in a modern age. So why should Bond have to return to the 60s time period in an attempt to regain the essence of the classic version? Most fans would agree that Timothy Dalton was the closest film actor we've seen to Fleming's original creation, and his films were definitely a product of the late 80s in their stories and subject matter. The Living Daylights in particular is probably the film of the last 40 years that feels most in line with classics like From Russia with Love and Thunderball. So I don't think Bond must be set in the height of the Cold War for him to embody the central character traits we associate with the golden age of James Bond. I'd rather see the character move with the times than retread old ground. If we want to adapt the Fleming stories again, I'm fine with either following the example of the Cumberbatch Sherlock series, adapting the stories to the modern era, or doing what the Craig films did, take unused elements and incorporate them into new stories. Bond has a spectrum of tones, from the deadly serious License to Kill to the goofy antics of Octopussy and Golden Gun. Craig gave us something closer to the more grounded, serious take on Bond, though even he sometimes indulged in more outlandish elements in his last two films. So I think it's time for a change. I don't want to see the serious, more character-driven side of the recent films gone exactly, but I wouldn't mind something more tongue-in-cheek. I think of all the previous films, The Spy Who Loved Me is the closest to what I would like to see. It can do something more serious, but it also casts a knowing look at some of its story elements and characters, knowing they are pushing the edge, but nevertheless can find ways to make it feel overall cohesive. In the same film where you have Anya and Bond having a frank conversation about the inevitability of death in their line of work, you can also have a man with steel teeth biting into a shark and a villain layer rising out of the water, and it doesn't feel out of place. I'm not saying we have to go full-blown comic book silliness with this series, but I think the Cuba sequence in No Time to Die is a pretty great showcase of this balance. It allows for both the cheesy fun of having a drink mid-fight and showing the more serious ramifications of the nanovirus. If you could find a way to do that for a whole film, I think you could get a Bond film that feels fairly timeless in its tone and appeal to audiences. And when was the last time Bond felt timeless? Just about every image of a man with a Commonwealth accent who has been seen wearing a tux prompts some headline around the world about whether or not he'd make a good Bond. This is the thing that gets the most tiresome to endure during an in-between actors era, as most tabloids are picking these people either because they look like Bond, have done Bond-like projects, or would stir up controversy by being cast. Plus, I agree with Calvin Dyson's assessment that they are only thinking if the film came out tomorrow and was a one-time thing. Bond is a commitment, with each new actor having to sign up for multiple films and have a willingness to be associated with that role for the rest of their lives. As such, I'd like an up-and-coming actor in their early to mid-30s who has some strong ideas about what they'd like to do with the role, so that the film can come out when they're approaching their mid to late 30s. Obviously, there can be an impediment to picking an actor because we are basing them off of their past work. Daniel Craig had this issue in the mid-2000s, when a lot of us judged him off of his filmography and without seeing the screen tests that Barbara and Michael saw, which clinched the deal. After that experience, I've learned to be open about an actor's physicality. He doesn't have to be reminiscent of the more Brosnan, tall, dark, and undeniably handsome crowd to work as the character. Remember, Fleming described him in the early novels as looking like Hoagie Carmichael. Aaron Taylor Johnson seems to be the frontrunner now, and while I'm not a huge fan of his, he does fit my recommendations. If I had my way, I would have started work on the new film in 2022 with Richard Madden in the role, as he's someone I could see leading a film with the tone I described earlier, though I think Jack Lowden might also be a fine pick. In reality, I'm not too picky on whether Bond must be English or whether he can be Scottish, Welsh, or Irish, obviously. I don't even think he must be white, as I think Regé-Jean Page might be a fine choice. But at the end of the day, I'll employ a wait-and-see tactic to whoever Eon decides to go with. I'm a bit less deterministic when it comes to casting the leading lady, as we've had many wonderful actresses from all over the globe become a Bond girl and have done the role justice. They can be anywhere from their early 20s to mid-50s, though I'd like to see the main Bond girl match their Bond actor more in age than before. I'd probably steer away from American actresses because I think a Bond woman should be a mixture of exotic beauty, intrigue, and someone who's been out in the world a bit. Now, we've obviously had examples of past Bond women who don't fit this description that have done just fine, so these aren't hard and fast requirements. The two main things I want here are a leading woman who is more involved with the plot, like Tanya or Natalia, and let's bring back the supporting Bond women. He doesn't have to sleep with them depending on the story, but I wouldn't mind seeing an agent who is a bit more liberal with his sexual partners. I'm not saying he should bang every woman right and left, as I would like them to matter to the story, but I also don't want us to shy away from the fact that Bond's sexuality is part of his toolset. He's not above sleeping with women for the sake of the mission or because he has a small connection to them. Bond villains are the most free of requirements because you can do virtually anything with them. You can go with big and grandiose megalomaniacs, darker and more physical complements to Bond, public personas that might have cult followers, or mysterious heads of worldwide covert organizations. Plus, there's no expectations about their casting beyond getting character actors. You could have a man, woman, or other, any skin tone, bombastic or quiet, tall or short, and it could work. So with this buffet of options, what would I go with? Well, I wouldn't mind having the mysterious organization again, more subtle in the first couple of entries and gradually building to a larger reveal. However, since we just had that with Craig, I think I'd prefer a single menace again. No ties to other villains, just a guy running a scheme on his own. Obviously, he must have minions underneath him, and he can run an organization like Carver or Sanchez. He can be a political figure or more of a shadowy rogue element. Whatever you do, can we please have a standout henchman again? Ever since GoldenEye, I've been eager for some iconic, colorful enforcers of the main villain, and while we have had some fun ones like Dr. Kaufman and Mr. Hinks, I'd like us to embrace that element again. As for the big scheme, I'm not too keen on an Agent of Chaos kind of plan. I'd like something more to the point, whether that be a get-rich-quick scheme or an end-of-the-world scenario through a specific means like poison or grand warfare. Some may wonder if the grand warfare plots and terrorists of past films would be a little too real for some people now and maybe a little tone-deaf. But I'd like us to stop being afraid of that possibility. We live on a planet full of humans with unique stories, so just about anything you put on screen is going to resemble someone's past or environment. If we can do war films commenting on current political circumstances, serial killer horror films inspired by real-life events, and dramas featuring abusive relationships, why is it an issue when a clear work of fiction wants to depict a villain that may resemble real-life figures, when fiction looks to reality to cast its villains? If you can't tell by now, I'm a huge fan of the Bond soundtracks. John Barry and David Arnold regularly appear when I'm looking for something to listen to as I'm doing house chores or driving around doing errands. So I'm always excited to hear who will score the next film. Like a lot of folks, I've not been too keen on the soundtrack since Arnold's departure, though I thought Hans Zimmer's offering was a surprise improvement from Newman's duology. For the next Bond film, I'd like to hear something less dour and heavy. Some smooth spy material with bombastic action cues and lovely uses of the main title theme, similar to what Barry and Arnold excelled at. I would very much welcome Arnold coming back if he was up for it, but my request would be to tone down the electronics. While they add a certain edge to action scenes, Arnold had a tendency to let them become overbearing and sound like unmusical noise at times. If you must have the electronics, I'd rather it be more integrated like Tomorrow Never Dies or Quantum of Solace, where the orchestra still had a dominating presence and the synth was the spice to the music. I actually think Henry Jackman's scores from X-Men First Class or the first Kingsman film has some good examples of what I would like to hear. In regards to the title song, this is where I throw my hands up. I'm not joking when I talked about how often Barry and Arnold are heard throughout my day. I mostly listen to film soundtracks and world music with some occasional respites, so I'm not really up to date on more modern singers. One whose name has been thrown around that I think might actually be a decent pick is Dua Lipa. I want to clarify though, I don't think her traditional music style is exactly what I want, but the voice is pretty close. Listen to her live and imagine a less poppy song, and I think we'd have something right on the money. But honestly, I actually like what the producers had been doing with the Craig songs, mostly. So they've earned my trust enough that I'm not going to reject their next choice without giving them a chance. I would prefer something in tone closer to Diamonds Are Forever and The World Is Not Enough. Something with a powerful female vocalist and more soulful without being a quieter, more reflective piece. But hey, if they want to do another rock piece like You Know My Name and A View to a Kill, I'd be fine with that too. Whatever story comes next, I would request that we stay away from doing origins and early adventures. I don't want to see a Bond in his early 20s working his way up to being a 00. I want to see 007 in the prime of his career. We haven't gotten a lot of that since Die Another Day, and I'd like to go back to that. It's a similar problem I have with some superhero series. I like origin stories just fine, but we don't always need to dramatize the early years to set ourselves apart from past works. Audiences are smart enough that you can drop us in the middle of someone's career and we can follow along just fine. No one complained when we started the Star Wars series mid-Galactic Civil War. Indiana Jones didn't get an origin story until much later. Both Rocksteady and Insomniac Games started their respective superhero series mid-career, so why can't we do that here? The one thing I would bring over from the recent films is care for continuity. Not that Craig was the best at this, but the continuity issues in the original run of 20 films can keep a die-hard fan awake at night, and Craig only really had a few minor hiccups. I think Star Trek Strange New Worlds is a good example of how to move forward with continuity. Sprinkle in just enough so that we're rewarded for paying attention, but not so much to make the order of films so essential that we're lost if we haven't seen everything. Make the films accessible enough to casual fans, but remember where we are in the man's life. Related to my earlier thoughts on adapting the Fleming works again, there are plenty of continuation books and comics that came afterward, so if you're looking for further inspiration from print, why not try some of those? We've already seen elements of Colonel's son brought into the films, so why not look at Raymond Benson, Anthony Horowitz, Charlie Higson, or one of the one-offs like Jeffrey Deaver and William Boyd? I think stories like With a Mind to Kill and Solo have the potential to make for some really cool films. Dynamite Entertainment has been producing Bond comics for a while, and Eidolon and Black Box feature elements we've never seen the films tackle. If you broaden your sights beyond the Fleming originals and previous films, there's a lot more to be brought to the big screen if you're encountering writer's block in creating original stories. As much as I would love to have Bond films every few years, we've seen how oversaturation can kill enthusiasm and creativity. Timing is everything when sustaining interest in a franchise. Too much too soon leads to audience fatigue. Too little over too much time results in audiences questioning why you even bothered making the piece. Too often, I hear people wondering if Bond is even worth having around anymore. In my very biased opinion, the answer is a resounding yes. Bond has had films in the past that silenced the majority of critics on this matter, such as The Spy Who Loved Me, GoldenEye, and Casino Royale. If Bond can survive the social upheaval of the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, why can't he survive now? So I'm not ready to write him off yet. Now, this is a bigger topic I'd love to address in a separate video analyzing the character in an attempt to see how he has stuck around for so long. So for now, I'll just get back to my original topic. I think every 2 years might be a bit too soon. See what happened with previous Bond actors when they had that frequency. And 5 years is too long. I think 3 to 4 is about right. Let's give enough cooking time to get that script right. And trust me, interest will not have cooled off so much that you risk losing hundreds of millions of dollars by waiting around an extra year. People would rather see finely crafted pieces every few years than rushed but functional pieces every year just so that the fat cats can buy a fourth vacation home. I do like having quantity, but I'd rather quality be not sacrificed so frequently. Sure, there are those rushed but functional films that make a lot of money, but they're usually quickly forgotten about. Okay films may have their spot for a time, but great films are loved forever. Despite whatever the current viewing numbers are of Section 31 on Paramount Plus, I guarantee people will still be talking fondly about Wrath of Khan, or The Undiscovered Country, or The Voyage Home in 3 years' time. Same with James Bond. Outside of the fandom, you don't hear a lot of people talking about The Man with the Golden Gun, or Tomorrow Never Dies, the perfectly fine but functional films. You hear people talk about GoldenEye, Casino Royale, and Skyfall, the ones that had time to be developed. So let that be a lesson to studios and filmmakers. In your effort to get the next paycheck, let the constitution of the piece be as big a factor in your creation. So this was a fun exercise that turned out to be a much bigger thing than I originally intended. What do you think? What would you like to see for the next adventure? Do you agree with anything I said? Or is everything here just the tantrum of a longtime fanboy who won't let one dormant franchise die? Let me know. No matter your opinion, I'm sure that whatever happens with Bond 26 will be something that makes the world take notice. And hey, the first film from a new Bond actor is usually amongst their best, so let's hope that good luck streak keeps going.